the baby wouldn't stop crying. 4 hours, 17 minutes. Through turbulence, through 3 different flight attendants, through a first-class cabin full of people pretending not to hear. That baby screamed, and not one single person moved to help. Not because they didn't hear him, because of the man holding him. So what did a grieving single mother do, sitting 3 rows back, her hand pressed to her own chest? She did something no one on that plane could have predicted. Something that changed both their lives forever. Flight 214, London to New York, 40,000 feet above the Atlantic. In first class, silence is a luxury people pay a great deal of money for. Tonight, that luxury was gone. The crying had started somewhere over Ireland. It hadn't stopped since a baby, impossibly small, impossibly pale, bundled in a midnight dark blanket, his tiny fists clenched, his face flushed, his cries carrying that particular pitch that gets under the skin and refuses to leave. The flight attendants had tried everything. Warm formula, a pacifier, gentle rocking in the aisle. Each time the same result. The baby turned away, screamed harder, and the man holding him went very, very still. That stillness was the problem, because the man holding him was not the kind of man you approached. He sat at the very front of the cabin, as though the seat had been built for him alone. Long white hair, not the white of age, something older, colder, more deliberate, a jaw like carved stone, shoulders that filled the space around him the way mountains fill a horizon. And his eyes, black, depthless, patient in the way that only things are patient when they have outlived everything that ever tried to stop them. No one knew his name, but the body knows danger before the mind does, and every single passenger in that cabin had quietly, instinctively moved as far from him as their seats would allow. He hadn't spoken to anyone. He hadn't needed to. But here is what no one in that cabin understood yet. That baby's crying wasn't just hunger. It was a signal, ancient, supernatural, already being heard by things far worse than anything on that plane. 3 rows back, seat 4A. Ivy Chen sat with her eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap. 28 years old, a pediatric nurse. She had booked this flight to attend a grief counseling workshop in New York. One of those quiet, desperate attempts people make when they don't know how else to survive. 6 months ago, she had a daughter. A little girl named Emma, dark curls, a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. Emma died in her sleep. No warning, no reason. Just gone. And Ivy had been trying to find a reason to keep going ever since. She had stopped telling people about Emma. It was easier that way. People never knew what to say, and she was so tired. Tired of watching them search for words while she held herself together with both hands. So she sat in seat 4A, eyes closed, headphones in, trying to breathe. And then the crying reached her. Not as noise, as memory. She had heard that cry before, every night for 6 months. In the silence of a nursery, she couldn't bring herself to dismantle. That is not a hungry baby, she thought, without knowing why she was so certain. That is a baby who lost his mother. She opened her eyes, and then, slowly, in the way the body remembers what grief has not yet finished taking. She felt the warmth spread across her chest. Her milk had come in. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum and sat very still. 6 months, she thought. 6 months and my body still doesn't know she's gone." She looked toward the front of the cabin. The man with white hair was staring down at his son. His jaw was tight, his hand large, pale, capable of God knows what. Trembling. Just slightly, just once, but Ivy saw it. And something inside her, something she had spent 6 months trying to bury, cracked open, like a window after a long winter finally being pushed free. She stood up. The man in the next seat grabbed her arm. "Don't." Low, urgent, the way people whisper when they're genuinely afraid. "I've seen that man before. In certain places, he is not." He stopped, swallowed hard. "Just don't." Ivy looked at him. Then she looked at the baby. "Someone has to," she said. She walked down the aisle. Every head turned. The flight attendant near the galley took one step forward, then stopped, frozen by some instinct she couldn't name. The man heard her coming before she reached him. Those black eyes rose from his son's face and fixed on her with a stillness so absolute, it felt like being pinned to the air. Ivy didn't slow down. She stopped beside him, looked at the baby, at the tear-wet cheeks, the tiny trembling chin, the exhaustion of a newborn who had been crying so long he'd forgotten how to stop. And she said, very quietly, "I know what he needs, and I think I'm the only one on this plane who can give it to him." The cabin went silent, not the polite silence of people pretending not to listen. The absolute silence of people who have stopped breathing. The man stared at her. Something moved behind those ancient eyes. Not quite surprise, something older than surprise. Something that hadn't stirred in a very long time. "You are not afraid of me," he said, not a question. "I've already lost the thing I was most afraid of losing," Ivy answered. "There's nothing left to be afraid of." In that moment, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, surrounded by strangers, holding nothing but her grief and her courage, this single mother did the unthinkable. She reached for the Vampire King's baby. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the moment she reached for that child, she didn't just save his life. She stepped into a world 500 years older than anything she had ever imagined. A world she might never be able to leave. Stay with us, because what happens next? In that airplane restroom, and in the ancient castle waiting for her on the other side of the world, will change everything you think you know about love, loss, and what a mother is capable of. The airplane restroom was barely large enough for one person. With a baby, it felt like the whole world had compressed into the size of a confession booth. Ivy locked the door, sat down, held out her arms. The man hesitated. 1 beat, 2. "This is a stranger," something in him said. "A mortal woman. She doesn't know what you are, what your son is, what this will cost her." But the baby was trembling. His lips had gone from pink to white. His cries had thinned into something barely audible, the sound of a child running out of fight. He placed his son in Ivy's arms. The moment the baby settled against her chest, the crying stopped. Not gradually, not reluctantly. Instantly, like a candle finding its flame. The silence that followed was so complete, Ivy felt it in her teeth. She looked down at him, at the dark lashes fanning against his cheeks, the tiny fist uncurling against her collarbone. Something moved through her like warm water, something she had no name for. You look like you've been waiting for someone, she thought. Me too, little one, me too. Outside the restroom door, she could feel the man standing, still, waiting, like a weather front, enormous, charged, impossible to ignore. When it was done, when the baby had nursed and fallen into the deep, boneless sleep of a child who has finally let go, Ivy opened the door. The man looked at his son, then at her. Something crossed his face that centuries of living had not prepared him for. He hasn't slept, he said quietly, since his mother died. How long ago? Ivy asked. 8 weeks. 8 weeks, a newborn, without peace, without a mother. Ivy said nothing for a moment. She just looked at the baby, at the small chest rising and falling, at the way his fingers had curled around the edge of her sleeve and were still holding on even in sleep. Even in sleep, he holds on, she thought. So do I. I'm sorry, she said finally. She meant it the way only people who have truly lost someone can mean it. Deep, structural, without performance. He reached into his jacket and produced a card, matte black, no logo, no title, just an address handwritten in silver ink. And on the back, a single word. Transylvania. I never forget a debt, he said. Come to dinner. Let me thank you properly. Ivy stared at the card. Every sensible instinct she had said, pocket it and never think about it again. She put it in her pocket. 3 days later, Ivy stood at the iron gates of a castle that looked like it had been built by someone determined to keep the world out. She told herself she was coming for closure, for the simple satisfaction of knowing the baby was all right. She did not tell herself the truth, that her apartment in London had become a place where silence had weight, that the grief workshop had not helped, that for the first time in 6 months, something had made her feel like a person again instead of a monument to loss. A woman opened the gates, around 60 in appearance, though something about her eyes suggested she had been 60 for a very long time. Dark dress, silver hair pinned precisely, an expression that said she had seen everything and found most of it wanting. Miss Chen, I am Teresa. The master is expecting you. Inside, the castle was not what Ivy had imagined. She had expected cold stone corridors, Gothic darkness. What she found was firelight, the smell of something baking, heavy tapestries in deep reds and greens, rooms that felt, against all logic, like they had been lived in, carefully, for centuries. And in the center of the largest sitting room, in a chair that was almost but not quite a throne, sat the vampire king, with the baby asleep on his chest. He stood when she entered, carefully, so as not to wake his son. And Ivy noticed that the cold authority he'd worn on the plane like a second skin was still there, but thinner here, like armor he hadn't remembered to fully put on. You came, he said. You seemed surprised. I am. No one comes here willingly. Ivy looked around the room, at the portraits on the walls, the centuries layered into the stone, the weight of a life lived so long it had become architecture. What is this place? She asked. Home, he said simply. For just a moment, the word sounded like the loneliest thing she had ever heard. Dinner was candlelit. A man named Luca joined them briefly, the vampire king's cousin, broad-shouldered, a scar at his temple, eyes that catalogued everything. He assessed Ivy with quiet precision, then left without ceremony. When the silence had stretched long enough to mean something, Ivy set down her glass. "You should tell me what your son is, what you are, because I'm a pediatric nurse, and I know that what happened on that plane was not ordinary." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "it was not." And then he told her. Not everything, not at first, but enough. Enough that Ivy sat very still and reminded herself she was a woman who had already survived the unsurvivable, that this was simply the next impossible thing. When he finished, the fire had burned lower. The baby stirred. Without thinking, Ivy reached for him. The vampire king went still, watching her lift his son, settle him, murmur something soft against his dark hair. Something enormous moved through that stillness, something unspoken. She fits here, he thought, like something that has been missing from a room so long you forget what the room was for. On the third day, Teresa brought Ivy to a small stone room she hadn't been shown before. One window facing east, cold, quiet. On a wooden table sat a box, old, dark, bound in leather, worn soft by centuries of handling. Inside, letters, dozens of them, written in a hand Ivy didn't recognize, but somehow understood was Isabella's. "She wrote them during her pregnancy," Teresa said. "The master has tried to read them. 4 times, he cannot." Ivy looked at the letters, at the box, at the pale morning light on the stone wall. "Why are you showing me?" Teresa was quiet for a long moment. "Because you are the first person he has allowed past that door in 200 years, she said quietly. "And I know what it looks like when a man is deciding whether to live again. I thought you should know what it costs him." Ivy picked up one of the letters, just one, held it without reading it, felt the weight of it, the paper thin and soft from being handled, from being almost red, then put back, again and again. He came back to this box 4 times, she thought. 4 times he tried, and 4 times something stopped him. She set it back down carefully, the way you set down something that belongs to someone else's grief. "I won't read them," she said. "They're his." Teresa looked at her for a moment, then gave a small, precise nod, the kind that means, "Yes, that is exactly right." That night, Ivy sat with the baby in the nursery. The vampire king stood in the doorway. Too far to touch, too close to pretend he didn't want to. "Tell me about Emma," he said. Ivy's hands went still on the blanket. No one asked her that anymore. They asked how she was coping, whether she was managing. They never asked about Emma, the actual girl, the dark curls, the laugh that filled whatever room she was in. Her throat tightened. "She loved rain," Ivy said finally. "She was 4 months old and she loved rain. She'd go completely still whenever she heard it, like it was music." He was quiet. "Isabella loved snow," he said. "She said it made the world gentle." They sat in the nursery with the baby sleeping between them. Centuries of loss in the air around them. Neither of them spoke again for a long time. They didn't need to. Something inside her shifted, slowly, with the particular terror of someone who knows what it means when walls begin to come down. She was not just here for the baby anymore. On the 4th night, Ivy came to the nursery half asleep and found him already there. Sitting in the low chair by the crib, one large hand curled around his son's tiny foot, speaking in an old language, something soft and rhythmic, something that sounded like a lullaby from a world that no longer existed. He stopped when he saw her. She should have left. She didn't. She crossed the room and sat on the floor beside his chair, her back resting against it, and they stayed like that, not quite touching, not quite separate, while the baby's breathing deepened back into sleep. "You called me family," Ivy said softly. 4 days ago. You said it like you meant it." "I did mean it." "People like us, Bastian, people who've lost what we've lost." She stopped, started again. "It doesn't work that simply." "I know," he said, and then more quietly, "I know." The fire had burned to embers. The room was warm, full of the particular silence of a sleeping child. He reached down. His hand found hers in the dark, and Ivy, who had not let anyone hold her hand since the morning she had to say goodbye to Emma, did not pull away. When he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead, she closed her eyes. And when the kiss moved, slowly, inevitably, she felt it. A warmth that traveled inward, deep, ancient, not entirely human, not entirely safe. The blood-milk bond, some part of her mind whispered. He warned you about this. But she had stopped being afraid of things that felt like coming home. "Stay," he breathed against her hair. "Not for Marco, for yourself." And Ivy, for the first time in 6 months, said yes. She woke the next morning to voices in the corridor. Low, tense. Bastian's voice, cold again, stripped of everything she had heard the night before. The voice of something that had ruled for 5 centuries. And another voice, older, crueler, deeply satisfied. She pressed her ear to the door. "The mortal woman," the other voice said, "the one bonded to your air. I know everything about her, Bastian." Silence. "If you want her to survive the week, you will come to me, alone." Ivy stood motionless on the cold stone floor, her heart beating very fast. She looked down at her own hand, the same hand that had reached for a crying baby on a plane, the same hand he had held in the dark last night and called family. So this is how it begins, she thought, not with a choice, with a consequence. Just when she thought she could trust again, the past returned. And this time it had not come alone. If this story is already living inside you, hold on, because what comes next will test everything Ivy and Bastian have just found, and threaten to destroy it before it has the chance to begin. The explosion didn't announce itself. One moment the castle was quiet, that deep, stone-breathed quiet of a building that has absorbed centuries of silence. The next moment, the floor shuddered beneath Ivy's feet. Like something buried had finally decided to wake. She was still in the corridor, still with her palm flat against the door, Vittorio's voice still echoing in her memory. "If you want her to survive the week, come to me alone." Then the second impact hit. The lights went out. Darkness, complete, immediate, the kind that has no bottom. Ivy pressed herself against the wall, forced her breathing down, nurse instincts taking over. Assess, orient, move. From somewhere below came voices in languages she didn't know, and beneath them, a low resonant pulse, a frequency too old for modern ears, moving through the stone, up through her feet, into her chest. She had no name for what she was feeling. She didn't need one. The door at the end of the corridor burst open. Teresa, her silver hair unpinned, a long blade in her hand that Ivy had absolutely not known she owned. She crossed the hallway in 4 strides and seized Ivy's arm. Come now. Marco. Ian Bastian has him. Move. They ran. Down a corridor Ivy had never seen before, behind a tapestry, through a narrow door carved directly into the stone, the kind of passage that only exists in houses that were built to survive things. Teresa moved like someone who had done this before. She probably had. How many of them? Ivy asked, breathless, running. Enough, Teresa said. Don't slow down. At the end of the passage, Teresa stopped, pressed her back flat against the wall, listened. Ivy listened too. Footsteps above, fast, deliberate, the sound of people who know exactly where they are going. They've been here before, Ivy realized. Someone showed them the layout. Someone who knew this castle from the inside. She didn't say it out loud. She filed it away. They kept moving. The safe chamber was deep in the castle's foundations, a room that predated the rest of the building by 3 centuries, sealed with protective wards that felt, to Ivy, like standing inside a held breath. Bastian was already there. He stood in the center of the room with Marco against his chest, his face stripped of every layer Ivy had spent 5 days watching soften. The warmth was gone. The man who had held her hand in the dark and whispered stay. Gone. What remained was the creature from the plain. Ancient, cold, furious in the controlled way of things that have learned not to waste their rage. Take Marco, he said the moment he saw her. Not a request. Hold him, do not put him down regardless of what you hear. Ivy took the baby. Marco stirred, blinked, then settled against her chest with the trust of a child who had already decided she was safe. She watched Bastian move toward the chamber door. You're not leaving, she said. I have to. You said this room was protected. From the outside, he paused at the door. The wards can be broken from within if someone already inside the castle is working against us. A beat. Luca is checking. Ivy stared at him. You think someone betrayed you? He didn't answer. Which was answer enough. There was a name on his face that he wasn't saying. A suspicion he had been carrying since the first explosion. Someone had let them in. Someone who knew the wards. Someone who had been inside these walls for a long time. Ivy didn't press him. Some things a person has to arrive at alone. From above came a crash, something structural, heavy, permanent. Then silence. The silence of a confrontation that has moved past the point of words. Marco made a small sound against Ivy's collarbone. She pressed her lips to his dark hair. Go, she said softly. We'll be here. Bastian looked at her for one long moment. At her and his son, together in the dim light of that sealed room. Something moved across his face she would spend a long time trying to name. Then he was gone. The door sealed behind him, like a vault closing. For 11 minutes the chamber held. Ivy counted them, old hospital habit. When everything is wrong, you count what you can control. 11 minutes of Marco breathing, the distant sounds of struggle above, the cold of the stone pressing through her robe. She used those 11 minutes wisely. She checked Marco from head to toe, nurse habit, checking pupils, checking temperature, checking the tiny pulse at his wrist. He was calm, unnervingly calm, as though some ancient instinct in him understood that panic was not useful right now. Smart baby, she thought. You get that from your father. Then the ward broke. She felt it before she saw it. A drop in pressure, like the room exhaling. and the door opened from the outside, in a way it was not supposed to be able to open. 3 figures, long dark coats, eyes that caught no light, and behind them, moving with the unhurried patience of someone who has never needed to hurry. A man who appeared to be around 60, but carried himself like something far older. Silver at his temples, cold eyes the color of old ice, a smile perfected across centuries of use. Vittorio Dracul. Miss Chen, he said, as though they had a prior acquaintance. I've been looking forward to this. Ivy pulled Marco closer, stood her ground. Don't come any closer to this baby, she said quietly. Vittorio tilted his head. Something flickered in his expression, something that was almost respect. No trembling, he said softly. No screaming. Do you know who I am? I know what you want, Ivy said. And you didn't come here for the baby. You came for Bastian. Marco is leverage, which means you need us alive. She held his gaze. So let's not pretend this is something it isn't. 3 seconds of absolute silence. Then Vittorio smiled, a real one this time, which was somehow worse than the practiced version. You, he said, are going to be a great deal of trouble. He stepped closer, and for the first time Ivy saw it. Not cruelty in his eyes, not triumph. Something older than both. Grief. Worn down to its sharpest edge. The kind that has been carried so long it no longer hurts the person holding it. It just hurts everything around them. He really did lose a son, she thought, and this is what happened to him afterward. She said nothing, not yet. She tucked that thought away and held Marco tighter and let Vittorio believe he had won. For now, it was safer that way. The castle Vittorio brought them to was everything Bastian's was not. Cold, intentionally so. Stone corridors stripped of warmth, of color, of any evidence that life had ever been welcome here. Portraits lining the walls, faces that all shared the same quality. The eyes of people who decided long ago that softness was a liability. They gave Ivy a room, locked the door, left a single candle. Marco was awake now, quiet against her chest, in that uncanny way he had, as though he understood that silence was currently required. Ivy sat on the stone floor, her back against the bed, her knees drawn up, the baby warm against her heart, and she did what she had learned to do in the worst months of her life. She breathed. She stayed inside this moment, not the ones ahead. Emma, she thought, I wish you could tell me what to do. Emma, who had loved rain, who went completely still whenever she heard it, like it was music. There was no rain here. There was no music. There was only the candle, the locked door, Marco breathing. And then, very softly, Marco reached up. His small hand found her face in the dark. His fingers, with that uncanny precision she had noticed before, touched her cheek. And Ivy felt it. Not heard, not saw, felt. Deep in the center of her chest, like a thought that wasn't hers. Mom. She went very still. Mom, here, safe, the mind-reading ability Teresa had mentioned. Still primitive, still forming. A tiny boy reaching through his ancient inheritance and finding her. Calling her mother. The tears came then. Not the kind that want to be seen, the deep kind, structural, stored too long in too small a space. She pressed her face into his dark hair and held him, and let herself feel all of it. The grief of Emma, the fear of this locked room, the impossible, devastating fact that she would walk into all of it again without a moment's hesitation. Because this is what mothers do, she thought. We stay, even when staying is the most frightening thing imaginable. We stay. And in that moment, alone in a locked room, with a baby who had just called her mother for the first time, she realized the terrible truth. She was not going to leave him. Not Marco, not this world, and not the man who had handed her his son on a plane and changed the entire direction of her life. She was already in too deep to save herself. And for the first time, she was not sure she wanted to be saved. Sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is refuse to let go. If Ivy's story is touching something in you, stay with us. Because what Bastian is about to do to get her back will cost him everything he has left. He came alone. No escort, no visible advantage of any kind. Just a man, walking through the iron gates of the Drakel castle in the gray before dawn, his white hair loose, his hands open at his sides, wearing the particular stillness of someone who has already decided exactly how far he is willing to go. The guards at the gate didn't stop him. They looked at each other, and then they stepped aside. Some things even loyalty cannot override. Vittorio was waiting in the courtyard, amused in the way that people are amused when they believe they have already won. I expected more of an entrance, he said. I'm here to negotiate, the Vampire King said, not to perform. And what do you have to offer me? I have your son. I have your woman. Everything. Vittorio paused. The European clans, Bastian said quietly. My seat on the ancient council. 5 centuries of territorial holdings, all of it, in exchange for Ivy and Marco walking out of this castle tonight, unharmed, unbound, free of any claim. A long silence settled over the courtyard. You would surrender the vampire world, Vittorio said slowly, for a mortal woman you have known 5 days. Without hesitation, Bastian said. Vittorio studied him for a long moment, searching for the angle, the calculation, the hidden move. There wasn't one. In 600 years of scheming and accumulating power, Vittorio had learned to recognize when a man was bluffing. Bastian was not bluffing, and that, more than any army, more than any ancient force, was what made Vittorio afraid. You love her, Vittorio said. Not a question, not a taunt, something quieter than both, as though the word had cost him something to say. Yes, Bastian said simply. A long pause. I loved my son, Vittorio said. His voice changed on those words, just slightly, just enough for someone who was paying attention to notice. And your war took him from me. I know, Bastian said. You have never said that before. I know that too. The courtyard went very still. 2 floors above, Ivy heard the gates open. She had been awake for hours. The candle had burned to a stub. Marco slept against her chest, his breathing the one steady thing in the world. She crossed to the window, narrow, iron-barred, facing the courtyard below. And there he was, Bastian, walking toward Vittorio with his hands open and his head unbowed, offering himself like a man, laying down something he has carried for 5 centuries and is finally tired of holding. She understood immediately what he was doing, what it would cost him. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass. The same gesture she had made against the hospital corridor window the morning they told her about Emma. The same gesture she had made against the door when she first heard Vittorio's voice. The echo of every moment she had ever stood on the wrong side of a barrier, watching something she loved move away from her. Not again, she thought. Not this time. She looked down at Marco. Marco looked back at her with those dark, ancient eyes, and she felt it, soft as breath. Go. Just that. One word through the bond. Go. She did not wait to be let out. The transformation, the blood milk bond, had been quietly working in her. The strange new strength she had tried not to examine too closely. The moments when the dark was not quite as dark as it should have been. She stopped trying to ignore it. She wrapped Marco against her chest with a blanket from the bed, walked to the door, and pushed. The lock held for exactly 1 second. Then something in her, borrowed, ancient, entirely not her own, pushed back. The door opened. She moved through the Drakel castle like someone who had decided fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. Down the stairs, through the corridor, past 2 of Vittorio's guards who turned and did not move in time. She stepped into the courtyard just as Vittorio raised his hand. Stop. Her voice cut across the gray dawn like something thrown. Both men turned. Bastian went completely still, the stillness of someone braced for the worst who suddenly cannot locate it. Ivy, her name in his mouth, barely above a whisper. You need to go back inside. No, she said, I don't. She crossed the courtyard, stopped between them, between the old world and the new one, between 5 centuries of power and one woman in a borrowed robe holding a baby against her heart. She looked at Vittorio, and she saw it again, what she had noticed in the locked room. The grief behind the cruelty. Old, calcified, a wound that had never been tended to because the man carrying it had confused surviving with healing. She knew that confusion intimately. You lost your son, she said, not an accusation, a fact. In a war a century ago. Something shifted in those cold eyes, something she recognized. You have been carrying that grief for 100 years, she said, and you turned it into this. She looked at the castle around her, the stripped corridors, the hollow portraits, the architecture of a man who built an empire out of the refusal to heal. I know what that looks like from the inside. Silence. It doesn't work, she said. The control, the revenge, building walls so high that nothing can ever reach you again. She held his gaze steadily. I spent 6 months trying, and all I had to show for it was an empty apartment and a nursery I couldn't walk into. Vittorio stared at her. Bastian stared at her. Marco, against her chest, made a small sound, not a cry, not a demand, something softer, something that in a human child might have been called a sigh. Take your grief back, Ivy said to Vittorio, very gently. Stop trying to make Bastian carry it for you. It won't bring your son home, and it won't make the wound smaller. She paused. Nothing makes it smaller. You just learn, slowly, to carry it differently. For a long time, long enough that the sky began to shift, from gray toward the first pale suggestion of gold. No one moved. Vittorio looked at Marco, at the baby in this mortal woman's arms. Dark hair, pale skin, a child who had lost his mother before he ever knew her. He looked for a long time, and then he did something that none of his guards had ever seen him do in 100 years of service. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, just long enough to let something pass through him that he had been holding at arm's length for a century. When he opened them again, something in his face was different. Not softer, not kinder, but quieter, like a storm that has finally spent itself. Then Vittorio lowered his hand. Bastian did not wait for Vittorio to speak. He turned to Ivy and dropped to his knees, not in defeat, not in submission. In a gesture Ivy didn't know the name of, but understood through something older than knowledge. The gesture that said, "I choose you," above throne, above clan, above the age of the world. "I want you to know," he said, his voice completely steady. "I had already decided, before tonight, before the courtyard, I was going to give it all up, the clans, the council, the immortality." He held her gaze. "Not as a bargain, not as an offer, because you deserve to know that someone in this world has decided you are worth 500 years. Ivy's throat closed. She thought of Isabella's letters in their leather box, still waiting, still unread. She thought of Emma and rain. She thought of a trembling hand on a plane, a matte black card, a single word in silver ink. Transylvania. Come and see. She knelt down in front of him, in the gray dawn, in a courtyard that smelled of old stone and the approaching morning, and put her hand against his face. "You don't have to give up 500 years, she said softly. "You just have to give me the next ones." Something broke open in his expression. Something that had been sealed for a very long time. And for the first time in 5 centuries, the vampire king put his forehead against a mortal woman's and simply breathed. Behind them, Vittorio turned and walked back into his castle without a word. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. And Ivy, holding Marco with one arm and Bastian's face with the other, kneeling in the first light of a new morning, understood with a clarity that moved through her like warm water exactly what she was choosing. For the first time in years, for the first time since a quiet nursery and a silence that had no end, she knew exactly what she had to do. She was going to stay, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because, for the first time in a long time, here was somewhere worth being. The hardest battles are never the ones fought with force. They are the ones we fight inside ourselves. The choice to stay open, to let someone in after the worst has already happened. If this story is finding you at the right moment, hold on to it. The ancient vampire council met 3 days after the courtyard. Ivy was not permitted to attend. She sat in an anteroom with Marco on her lap and Teresa beside her. Teresa, who had fought off 4 of Vittorio's clan with a blade she had carried for 200 years and never once mentioned. They waited. "Will they accept the transfer of leadership to Luca?" Ivy asked. Teresa was quiet for a moment. "They will accept it," she said finally. "The blood milk bond is ancient law, older than the council, older than the clans." She glanced at Ivy. "And because you saved the vampire king's heir, that carries more weight in our world than you know." "I didn't do it for your world," Ivy said. "I know," Teresa said. "That is precisely why it worked." A long pause settled between them. Teresa looked down at Marco, at the way the baby had curled one small fist around Ivy's finger and was holding on in his sleep, the way infants hold on, without knowing they are doing it, without question. "She used to sit in this very room," Teresa said quietly. "Isabella, during the council meetings, she hated waiting too." Ivy looked at her. "She would have liked you," Teresa said, simply, without sentiment, the way someone states a fact they have been holding for a while and finally decided to release. "I thought you should know that." Ivy didn't trust herself to respond. She just looked down at Marco, at the dark hair, the pale lashes, the tiny fist holding on. "Thank you," she said softly, "for telling me." Teresa gave a small nod, then looked away, as though she had given something private and needed a moment to recover herself. Ivy understood. She had felt that way too, many times. In the months after Emma, when people said her daughter's name and she had to look away so they wouldn't see her face. Some kinds of love are too large for direct eye contact. When Bastian emerged from the council chamber 2 hours later, he looked like a man who had set down something extraordinarily heavy and was still adjusting to the absence of the weight. He crossed the anteroom and sat beside her. Marco reached for him immediately. That small, precise hand. Bastian caught it without thinking, the way he always did now, as though his hands had learned a new reflex. "It's done," he said. "Luca is officially recognized. The clan is his." A pause. "The council granted us permanent freedom from interference," he continued, "in exchange for one condition." "Which is?" He looked at her with an expression she had learned to read as his version of reluctant amusement. "They want you available to advise them if they ever face a situation involving the blood milk bond again." Ivy stared at him. "They want a pediatric nurse on retainer." "They want the woman who ended a century-long feud without anyone getting hurt," Bastian said. "There is a difference." For the first time in what felt like weeks, Ivy laughed. The way laughter comes back after a long absence, unexpectedly, as though the body has been holding it in reserve for exactly the right moment. Bastian watched her laugh, and something settled in his face. Not the careful warmth she had watched him practice, something quieter, something that had stopped performing and simply was. "Scotland," he said. "I promised you ordinary, a village, morning light." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then let's go," she said. The village was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and new arrivals were noted and assessed within 48 hours. The house sat at the edge of a field that turned gold in autumn and green in spring. A garden that had been abandoned long enough to become interesting. Windows that faced east and caught the first light of every morning. Nothing like a castle. Exactly what Ivy had not known she needed. The first morning, she stood in the kitchen in the early quiet. Marco asleep in the next room. Bastian in the garden. Doing something she suspected was less gardening and more standing very still, in a sky with no stone ceiling between him and it. She made tea. An ordinary act, kettle, cup, the sound of water beginning to heat. She looked around the kitchen, at the low wooden beams, the window above the sink, the hooks on the wall where she intended to hang dried herbs, and she felt the particular quality of a space waiting, gently, to absorb the shape of the people who had come to it. The house felt different now, not just from the castle, from everything before. Her apartment in London had smelled like closed curtains, and the specific emptiness of rooms where someone has stopped touching things. She had walked through it for 6 months, trying not to look at certain corners. This house smelled like old wood, damp grass, the possibility of something not yet named. Bastian came in from the garden with mud on his shoes and the look of a man who had discovered, at over 500 years old, that he found soil unexpectedly interesting. "There are things growing out there that I cannot identify," he said. "That's called a garden." "It seems disorganized." "That's also called a garden." He looked at the tea, then at her. Then he did the thing that still caught her off guard whenever it happened. He smiled, not the careful expression she had catalogued on the plane, a real one, slightly crooked, entirely his. She handed him a cup. He took it. Their fingers touched on the handle. Neither of them moved away. They married on a Tuesday. Because Ivy said weekends were for people trying to impress someone, and she was done with that. The church was small, stone. Bastian had relaxed about many things, but maintained strong opinions about architecture. Morning light came through the east window and lay across the wooden floor in long, warm rectangles. Teresa sat in the front row, dark dress only slightly more formal than her usual dark dress, her expression containing what Ivy had come to recognize as her version of deeply moved. Luca stood at the back. He had driven 11 hours from Transylvania. When Ivy asked why, he said only, "Someone has to represent the family properly." He straightened his jacket and refused to discuss it further. Ivy's mother and sister sat together, slightly bewildered by the Scottish church, entirely charmed by Marco, now 8 months old, conducting what appeared to be a thorough assessment of everyone present. A vampire elder arrived just as the ceremony began. He placed a small carved charm over Ivy's wrist. "Freedom from interference," he said quietly, "for as long as the bond holds." Then he left, the way people do when they have delivered exactly what was needed and nothing more. The vows were short. They had talked too much already, in nurseries, in courtyards, over morning tea, to need many more words. They said what they said simply, holding each other's hands in the morning light, while Marco sat on Teresa's lap and attempted with great concentration to eat a flower. Afterward, in the garden behind the church, string lights, long tables, the smell of food and grass, and the first edge of evening. Ivy stood with Bastian and watched Marco in Teresa's arms, reaching for the lights the way children reach for anything warm and bright and close. "He looks like her," Bastian said quietly. "Isabella, around the eyes." "I know, I've thought so too." A pause. "It's good," Ivy said, before he could ask. "It's good that he carries her. She should be in him." She looked up at Bastian. "Just as Emma is in me. They don't take up less space because we kept going. They travel with us." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles. Not a grand gesture, just a quiet one, the kind that means more because it isn't performed. And held on. The string lights swayed gently in the evening air. Marco laughed. A sudden, bright, entirely unexpected sound. His first real laugh. Teresa looked so startled she nearly lost her composure entirely. Luca had to turn away to hide his expression. Ivy felt it move through her like something unlocking. For the first time in years, she thought, grief and joy are in the same room. and neither one is asking the other to leave. She leaned into Bastian's shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her. They watched their son laugh in the fading light. And let it be enough. Some houses take time to feel like home. Some people take time to feel like family. But when it happens, quietly, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, there is nothing in the world quite like it. Carry this story with you today. Winter came to the village quietly, the way good things often do. Frost on the east-facing windows, the garden gone to sleep beneath it. Bastian, who had survived 5 centuries of war and ancient curses, became quietly and completely absorbed by the problem of keeping the cottage pipes from freezing. Ivy found this so specifically, wonderfully human, that she had to leave the room to laugh about it. Marco grew. 8 months became 10. 10 became 12. He pulled himself upright along the edge of the kitchen table and looked at the world with those dark eyes, ancient and new at the same time, the way only children manage to be. And one morning, without any ceremony at all, he took 4 steps across the kitchen floor, sat down hard, and looked entirely unimpressed with himself. Bastian was on his knees on the flagstone before the child had finished sitting. "He walked," he said, looking up at Ivy. "He walked," she confirmed. She crouched down beside him. They sat together on the kitchen floor while Marco examined a wooden spoon with the focused attention he brought to everything. And Ivy thought, this is it, this is the thing. Not the castle or the courtyard or the ancient council. This, the floor, the spoon, the ordinary morning. This was what they had given up 5 centuries of power for. And it was worth every single second. On a Sunday in February, when the light came in pale and clean through the east window, Ivy carried Isabella's leather box down from the study shelf, where it had sat, untouched, since Teresa packed it with their things. She set it on the kitchen table. Bastian looked at it for a long moment. "You don't have to," Ivy said. "I want to." He sat down, put both hands flat on the table. "I think I'm ready." A pause. "I think you made me ready." She sat across from him and poured 2 cups of tea while he opened the box and began to read. She did not watch his face. She looked out the window, at the frost on the garden, at the bare branches of the apple tree they had planted in November, at the particular quality of Scottish winter light, the color of old silver. From the small room off the kitchen came the sound of Marco talking to himself, the particular confident rambling of a 1-year-old, narrating his own existence to an audience of 1. Ivy listened to that sound and thought, 6 months ago I would have given anything to hear a child's voice in my house again. Now she had one. It was not the voice she had lost. It would never be that voice. But it was real, and it was here, and it was hers. After a long time, Bastian set the last letter down. His eyes were wet. He seemed uncertain what to do with that. A man rediscovering the mechanics of grief after centuries of sealing it away. She knew, he said quietly. In the letters, she knew she might not survive. He steadied himself. She wrote that she hoped, if she didn't make it, that Marco would find someone who could love him the way she intended to. The kitchen was very still. She described her, he said, the woman she hoped for, someone patient and brave, not afraid of what she doesn't understand, someone who would choose him, not because she had to, because she wanted to. He looked up at Ivy. She wrote one more thing, he said, at the very end of the last letter. Ivy waited. She wrote, "Tell her thank you, whoever she is. Tell her thank you for loving what I had to leave behind." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Ivy reached across the table. Her hand covered his. He turned his palm up and held on. Neither of them spoke for a while. Outside the window, something small and brown landed on the branch of the apple tree, sat there for a moment, then flew away. Ivy watched it go. Even the smallest things know when it's time to move, she thought, and when it's time to stay. Outside, the frost was beginning to melt, slowly, the way frozen things do when the light finally reaches them. That night, after Marco was asleep and the house had settled into its quiet, the creak of old wood, wind moving through the field, Ivy stood in the back garden under a sky so full of stars it looked crowded. Bastian stood beside her. She was 3 weeks pregnant. She hadn't told him yet. She was still turning it over, the way you turn something precious to check it's real before you say it aloud and make it permanent. She would tell him tomorrow, over tea, in the kitchen, in the ordinary morning light. Tonight she just stood under the stars and felt the full weight of everything that had led here. A flight from London. A baby who wouldn't stop crying on the plane. A single mother who stood up when everyone else stayed seated and did the unthinkable, not out of bravery, out of recognition, out of the simple, ancient knowledge that a child in pain needs someone to reach for him. A trembling hand, a matte black card, a single word in silver ink. A nursery she had finally been able to walk into again. Emma, who had loved rain. Marco, who had learned to walk. A new child, not yet anything but possibility, already loved. And she finally understood. Not as an idea, as something that had settled into her bones. Grief is not the opposite of love. It is love with nowhere left to go. And sometimes, if you stay open long enough, it finds somewhere. Not a replacement, never that. A continuation. She had told Bastian in the courtyard, they don't take up less space because we kept going. They travel with us. Emma was here. In the careful way Ivy checked every blanket, every breath, every quietly sleeping moment. In the woman she had become, softer and stronger at once. The way things become when they have been broken and choose, one ordinary morning at a time, to hold together anyway. Bastian put his arm around her. She leaned into him. Above them the stars burned quietly at an incomprehensible distance, the way they always have, the way they always will. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered for a moment. "That I'm glad I stood up," she said. "On the plane, I'm glad I stood up." He pressed his lips to her hair. "So am I," he said. "Every day, so am I." This story reminds us that the most ordinary act of courage, standing up when everyone else stays seated, reaching for someone when something in you says yes, even though the mind asks why, can change the entire direction of a life. Not just yours, someone else's too. For those of us who have known what it is to sit in a quiet house with an empty chair, a favorite mug, a calendar with dates that still ache when you look at them. Ivy's story is not a fantasy. It is a reminder that the places we are most afraid to open are often the ones that need the most air. If there is someone in your life, a grandchild whose calls have grown less frequent, a neighbor whose name you still don't know after all these years, a friend whose number you have been meaning to dial for months. This is the week to reach. Not with a grand gesture, just a cup of tea at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon. Just a phone call that starts with, "I was thinking about you today." That is enough. That has always been enough. Ivy did not plan any of it. She just stood up, and it was everything. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration purposes only.